Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am one of the show hosts here at the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Sarah, and I am excited about this podcast. I'm not one of the hosts. I may be on it at some point, but I am not one of the main hosts for this. But I'm still excited about this new podcast because maybe you're like me. Maybe you find yourself avoiding watching the news, reading the news, doing anything with the news because everything just seems so depressing, polarizing, negative, etc. You know, I realize that there's a lot going on in the world and that it needs to be reported on, but sometimes I just feel like we focus on all of the negativity. And this podcast is an antidote to that, maybe, let's say, an anecdote. It's the opposite of what you might find on your regular news podcast. For this podcast, the America's Still Beautiful podcast, we are going to talk about all things positive, all things uplifting, stories that make you laugh, stories that make you think, stories that might make you cry, but not because you're so depressed, but because you have happy tears, stories that you don't find on the regular news shows because, you know, scandal sells, drama sells, everything like that. You know, there's human interest stories here and there, but really when you watch the news, it's trying to get ratings and they're trying to get, you know, just put a spin on the news that's going to make people tune in, possibly get angry, possibly get sad. I mean, that's just the nature of the world today. So we are bringing you the America's Still Beautiful podcast here at the GSMC Podcast Network to help you with some news that will uplift you. You'll still be informed about some things in the world, but hopefully there'll be some things where you can leave the podcast feeling like America is still beautiful. Like we aren't just polarized and screaming at each other, but there is good in the world. What did Mr. Rogers say? When things seem dark, when there's an emergency, when things are going on, look for the helpers. And I think that this podcast is going to do just that. We're going to look to the helpers. We're going to look for the helpers. We're going to look for the people who are making the world a better place. So I hope you will join us for the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast. Our host Alyssa will be airing the first episode on Monday, December 2nd. So please tune in to hear some wonderful news stories. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a beautiful day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows. From the GSMC Podcast Network, from social media news to marketing news, and even weird news, the GSMC Podcast Network has you covered. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts, America's Still Beautiful podcast.